Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the third installment to the Story of Warcraft series written and narrated by Hengist. Today we'll be picking up where we left off in part 2, so if you've yet to hear the first two segments, now would be the best time to do so. Remember that this presentation is my unique interpretation of Blizzard's original story development, and although I'm presenting this information through my own artistic, individual work, I did not create the original characters or the events that take place throughout the story of Warcraft. I'm very glad to bring this new episode to all of the fans of the series, and I apologize that it took such a long time. If you would like to download the MP3 version of these episodes, there is a hyperlink in the description below, free of charge. Let's get started. We left off with the valiant defense of Malfurion Stormrage, Broxigar Sourfang, and the demigod Cenarius in a forest glade near the Kaldori city of Suramar. They had been attacked by a large wave of demonic fellhounds, whom were the servants of the demon lord Hakar, one of Archimonde's feared lieutenants in the Burning Legion. At the cost of little effort on the part of Cenarius and his companions, the fellhounds were completely eradicated by the power of nature and the incredible fury of one seasoned orc warrior. As Cenarius left to meet with the other ancients of Azeroth, he warned Malfurion of the coming danger. The complete powers of the Forest Lord have never been truly revealed, but it is fairly clear that he is a being that has vision into the future, and at this time likely understood that there were very dark forces at work, and that they had perhaps faced moments ago only the grunts of a far more cunning adversary. But perhaps even he was not aware of just how mighty their foes truly are. The Fellhounds were ravaging the Kaldori civilization from the outward in. The defenders began to fall in great numbers before the whole of their great army could even begin to be assembled. It is important to remember that the Kaldori society was one based on hierarchical extremes, where one's caste and heritage determined their significance and thereby their rights to leadership. A highborn by the name of Kurtalos Ravencrest was at the time the high commander of the Kaldori army. The army was a monumental force, but was in complete and utter disarray and severely lacking in organization. It took the elves hours to realize that the whole of their civilization was under a brutal attack, which was understandable given that the attacks were streaming from the very center of their beloved city, Zinashari. Within their army resided multitudes of experienced warriors, who were well equipped and skilled in the arts of combat. Warriors of this age would see more combat in the coming days than one of the modern timeline would see in an entire lifetime. At the army's core was the revered Moonguard, the devastating sorcerers of the Kaldori that drew their arcane power directly from the Well of Eternity. They were well versed in the explosive nature of magical energies, and could conjure spells and incantations that scorched, froze, and literally unmade enemies on the receiving end of their attacks. The finest Kaldori males were designated to be the spellcasters, and to become a Moonguard was a tremendous feat in their society. Females were forbidden from the use of arcane, and were instead assigned to serve as either warriors or priestesses in the temples of Elune, who were capable of using the divine light of their goddess to heal the wounds of their allies. As one, the Kaldori were capable of great things, and most certainly a match for the first infantry of the Burning Legion. But the forces that sought to besiege their world were of an ancient evil, and had been culminating in the furthest reaches of outer space and the twisting nether for thousands of years. They would not be able to stop the coming death alone. In the midst of these chaotic attacks, Malfurion had to find a way to enlighten his people of the truth, and he knew that it would require a great deal more deaths for them to consider what he had to say. Regardless, he ventured to meet with Lord Ravencrest himself, and tell him of what he saw in the Emerald Dream. He went to tell the High Commander that his queen had betrayed her people. Cenarius and the Kaldori were not the only ones aware of the Burning Legion's entrance into Azeroth. The dragon aspects, with Nosdormu's vision, knew of their coming long before Ashara and the Highborn began their summoning of Sargeras through the Well of Eternity. Nosdormu, in fact, would have foreseen all of this, yet it is not his duty to interfere with the course of nature, for Aman'Thul had granted him power over the realm of time on Azeroth, not the universe. Regardless of their original inception of the Burning Legion, the five of them were not confident in the mortals' abilities to defend the planet, seeing as it is their own doing that the Darksidon had even come this far. Neltharion in particular, whom is the Earth Warder and the lord of the planet's core, took it upon himself to personally eradicate the demons from Azeroth. In secret, Neltharion began crafting a mysterious artifact in the deepest chasms of the world. Only one species on Azeroth had yet burrowed as deep as so to intrude on his domain: the goblins. Neltharion made them his slaves and laborers as they built his underground dominion, which he used for his undisclosed plotting. He undertook the creation of a grand draconic weapon that he would use to slay Sargeras. With their aid, Neltharion crafted a magnificent incandescent disk of golden light. Into the disk he poured his very essence, along with a piece of his original Titan-empowered soul. Neltharion marveled at his creation, as it would forever be a perpetual source of immense and ancient power, indirectly blessed by the Titans themselves. Neltharion, however, had been tormented by the old gods for centuries up to this point, so they were undoubtedly instructing him all throughout the creation of his precious weapon. The power that imbued his disk could not have come from him alone, for at this point it was likely more powerful than the aspect himself. We cannot truly know the depths or the real origin of its power, but it can be considered an object that carries with it both the greatest light and the greatest darkness in the universe, having been enchanted by the child of a Titan, whom in this case would be Khaz'goroth, the one responsible for the creation of worlds, and also likely by the ancient and mortifying parasitic gods deep within Azeroth. Shortly after Neltharion had created his weapon, which he had come to call the Dragon's Soul, the Dragonflights met in council, which would prove to be the greatest gathering they would ever commit to discuss the current state of Azeroth. The Titans had charged the Aspects with the responsibility of protecting Azeroth from darkness, and should they fail to act here, they would very well fail in fulfilling their purpose. They met in the highest peaks of the tallest mountains in what would today be considered Northrend. Alexstrasza, Ysera, Malygos, and Neltharion awaited the arrival of the Lord of the Bronze Flight, Nosdormu, whom would have been incapable of being delayed, and they grew concerned, for since their creation Nosdormu had never missed an event such as this. It was obvious that something was ailing him, perhaps not in the current timeline, but likely in the past or future. Malygos and Neltharion were particularly close brothers, as they were the most similar and often joked with one another, always sharing laughter and joy together. At this meeting, though, Neltharion was distant, antisocial, and seemed to be speaking to himself in unintelligible words. Alexstrasza, as she was the Dragon Queen, who was also the largest and the one responsible for life on Azeroth, initiated their meeting and conducted the subject of its commencing. Together, the Aspects communicated that the invasion of the Legion was the result of the irresponsible use of magic on behalf of the mortal races, and that what they had caused could only be resolved through the intervention of the entirety of the Dragonflight. As Nosdormu arrived, the five of them agreed that they would fight back the demons of the Burning Legion and destroy the Keldori city around the Well of Eternity if the necessity presented itself. Naturally, given that Malygos was the one responsible for safeguarding the use of arcane magic, he felt that he had been inadvertently blamed for the coming disaster, and felt ashamed in a sense that he had failed to uphold Norgannon's wishes. This truth and this blame emotionally scarred him, and he would never feel the same towards the other Aspects, for they had not yet failed to uphold their duties, and because of this, he had so easily lost his pride. Only time would tell just how deep that wound would affect him, but one thing is for certain. He turned his anger and his respite at the matter towards the mortal races, for it was because of them that this had come to pass. The mortals, whom he knew were the responsibility of Alexstrasza to defend. Before the council had adjourned, Neltharion spoke to the other aspects, and warned them that the might of their combined flights would not be enough to stop the coming legion. He demanded that the only way to ensure their victory and the survival of Azeroth would be to strengthen his dragon's soul, which he finally unveiled to them. None of the other four knew exactly what the object was, but they could feel its miraculous power. The Earthwarder told them that if they were to defeat Sargeras' legion, each of the aspects would have to offer and put forth the same amount of power that he had already submitted to the dragon soul, further imbuing it with all the powers of the 5 aspects, making it the ultimate weapon, capable of vanquishing any foe at the blink of an eye. It would quite literally contain pieces of each of their souls, and with their essence it would be empowered with the powers of 4 titans. Such an object could change the course of any destiny. They were very cautious of Neltharion's proposition, and warned that should they proceed with his plan, the power of the artifact would be too great for any individual to wield, dragon aspect or not. But Neltharion was extremely firm in his beliefs that if they did not do this, they, along with the rest of Azeroth, would perish. The other aspects had known Neltharion since their creation, and they were, for all intents and purposes, siblings. They loved him very much, and trusted him with their lives, and as such, all 4 aspects agreed to combine their might. The dragon soul was infused with the essences of all 5 dragon aspects. After the process was complete, Neltharion conjured a complex spell matrix, encasing the dragon soul in an indestructible shield, making it irresistible to the powers of any of the 5 dragonflights. It was literally immune to the power of the other aspects. From that point on, they trusted Neltharion to use the weapon only if necessary, and he was the only one who could do so. Further south in Kalimdor, those sent by Nosdormu from the future, Krasis and Ronan, had been wandering the already destroyed civilizations of the Kaldori, looking for the one called Malfurion, whom Krasis had remembered played an integral role against the Legion in this ancient past. They did not find him, however. They were instead met by one of the greatest forces on the planet, and he was not happy to see them. Cenarius had been watching them, and he had determined that they were not of this time. As such, their existence was an alarming disturbance to him, and naturally, he took it upon himself to investigate this oddity of nature. The ancients did not meet the outsiders kindly, as they were considered to be somehow related to the cause of the most recent disaster that had befallen Azeroth. In a strictly logical explanation, they were in fact the result of evil forces working to counteract the natural course of nature. Eventually, however, after an intense interrogation on behalf of the ancients, they were released to aid the Kaldori in their struggle against the Burning Legion. Meanwhile, in the heart of Zinashari, the summoning process began accelerating with the aid of Hakar. Xavius cooperated very well with the demon, and very quickly learned the dark nature of arcane magic. Through the use of Shadow, Xavius was able to directly communicate with Sargeras himself. Sargeras saw into Xavius' soul as if he were a slate of glass. Xavius had a very dark nature, and it would seem that throughout the course of his entire life, he had been seeking to make Ashara his bride, and become king of the Kaldori. Sargeras also knew, firstly, of Ashara's capabilities, and to him, the Highborn were a people capable of great evil. Xavius quickly gained Sargeras' favor, as he submitted his conscience and will to his new god through every step of this meticulous process. Sargeras even showed Xavius more favoritism than Hakar himself, and promised that if the Highborn were successful in bringing him into their world, he would grant Xavius power beyond his greatest imagining. Just hours after Hakar stepped foot into Azeroth, the portal that had been conjured over the Well of Eternity had grown stable enough to begin ushering in more significant infantry of the Burning Legion. Through the portal came very tall, muscular humanoid soldiers wielding great pike weapons. The beings seemed to have no eyes, and it was clear to the Highborn that they had been transformed by this new form of arcane power they were exposed to. Hakar introduced them as the Fell Guard, the core infantry of the Burning Legion. They were the heart of the army that wreaked havoc across the stars. Xavius was very proud of their progress thus far, and when he showed the Fell Guard to the Queen Ashara, she was very pleased to see more of Sargeras' servants enter her palace. Xavius and Hakar now pressured the Highborn Magi to concentrate their efforts completely without rest on strengthening the portal. For Sargeras himself informed Xavius to prepare for the entrance of one of his greatest servants, and the one whom would be giving them orders from that point on. Though he told them that the power of the well was not sufficient to uphold this entrance. Xavius knew why, and told Sargeras that they would resolve the issue in a timely manner. After hours of endlessly channeling and strengthening the spell matrix that had opened up an interdimensional wormhole from the twisting nether to Azeroth, Xavius informed Ashara that the general of Sargeras would be arriving soon, and she grew exuberant in the anxiousness of meeting someone whom may be worthy of her presence. However, he told her that the Keldori outside of Zinashari were drawing so much power from the well to combat the evil Fellhounds that they could not summon enough power from the well to bring him into their world. Ashara instructed Xavius to shut out their access to the Well of Eternity, allowing them to harness its complete power. Xavius knew full well that in doing so, the Moon Guard would be rendered useless, and thousands more would perish at the will of the demons. It was then that Ashara made her intentions clear to Xavius. She sought to purge their imperfect civilization of all those unworthy of Ashara. Only the Highborn and those undeniably loyal to her would survive her new order after the union with Sargeras was finalized. The spell to confine the well's energies to the palace was not a simple one, but it was also not beyond the combined might of Xavius and Hakar, along with their instruction over the Highborn Magi. Shortly thereafter, the most fearsome being in all of the Burning Legion could be seen stepping through their dark portal and planting 4 reptilian feet in the palace of Zinashari. One of the Highborn sorcerers maintaining the portal was mortified by the appearance of this newcomer, and cried, "Elune, save us!" while turning to run away. The dark figure extended his hand and unleashed a spell of demonic and dark intent that literally turned the elf inside out, his fluids disintegrating amidst the palace chamber. The demon was monumental in size, wearing thick-plated armor that likely weighed well over a ton. His torso was robust, broad, and frighteningly muscular. His mouth was wide and inundated with razor-sharp teeth, enclosing 2 enormous tusks and a long, lanky, forked tongue. A fell, chaotic fire seemed to burn within his chest, for there was eternal flame emanating from his mouth, from his eyes, or lack thereof, and from the top of his head. He was at least 16 feet in height, giving his shocking features all the more impact upon the much, much smaller Highborn. He seemed to be aware of his surroundings in a way that didn't require him to physically turn his head, implying that his supposed lack of eyesight actually gave him a level of perception otherwise not possible. When he spoke, the area around him seemed to reverberate with his rudimentary, terrifying voice. He simply turned to Hakar and said, "There will be no more failure." Hakar bowed his head before Manroth, one of Sargeras' greatest lieutenants, and relinquished his command to the enormous reptilian creature. Manroth was the lord and the greatest among the Annihilan race, the first pit lord, made second in command of the Burning Legion army by Archimonde himself. The fact that Sargeras had sent him meant that Azeroth was of great importance. The Keldori now began to face even greater fury from the Burning Legion. The army had begun to fully assemble just outside of Black Rook Hold, which was the headquarters of Lord Ravencrest, the supreme commander of the army. Ravencrest was a bold elf, and he frequently moved out with scouts on the front lines to fully survey the combat situation so as to make more insightful decisions as a commander. As the Keldori evolved as a species, they grew more and more accustomed to the night, as they were nocturnal by nature and did most of their activities when the moon was highest in the sky, as Elune's grace inspired them and soaked them with the love she never ceased to give. Yet they had not yet seen combat like in the recent days, and they were never before truly aware of how great of an effect these circumstances played on their abilities. The Keldori were significantly stronger, more attuned to magic, and aware in the darkness of night. Their bodies were energized and their senses heightened so drastically that it was noticeable that they were marginal adversaries during the day. It was during this time that they had adapted the name the Night Elves, as their enemies would fear them greatest at night, and there was no mistaking that they had the blessing of Elune when touched by the moonlight. One such night, Lord Ravencrest moved out to evaluate the outskirts of Zinashari with a host of Moon Guard. Illidan Stormrage was among his guard. As they moved through a forest trail, the host was ambushed by fell hounds and fell guard. The warriors fought bravely and were more than capable of defending themselves, but ultimately fell victim to the demons' attacks. Just as it would seem Ravencrest were about to be consumed by the hounds, Illidan retaliated against the beasts. The situation greatly heightened his abilities, and he seemed to relish any opportunity to prove his worth. Using his magics, Illidan was able to burn the demons attacking Ravencrest, and mentally wielded his lost sword, which he used to spin at speeds so rapid he used it to decapitate the last few attackers, leaving the two of them the only survivors of the party. Ravencrest was appalled by Illidan's abilities, and disappointed that the Moonguard had fallen so easily where he had succeeded with such relative ease. He made Illidan the commander of the Moonguard, with authority so great he was to answer only to Lord Ravencrest and Queen Ishara. Illidan was overwhelmed with pride and filled with a sense of belonging. He had strove since his childhood to uphold the social expectation that he would do great things, for he was born with his brilliant amber eyes. He had finally been recognized for his exceptional abilities, and knew that his time to lead his people to greatness was at hand. Through him, the Moonguard would be an unstoppable force that would send the vile demons back through the hellish portal from whence they came. Upon reuniting with the host of Blackrook Hold, Illidan sensed a part of him drawing near. He knew that his brother had returned from his teachings with Cenarius, and from escaping with Broxigar. It was only a matter of moments before Malfurion was within his field of view. Illidan had recently learned of his romance with Tyrande, and that truth tore him apart. Illidan was in love with her. His rise to power and desire to lead had been out of an effort to live up to Tyrande's impossible standards. Since he had fallen in love, he lived to please her. Yet she had not chosen him. She had chosen Firion, the druid, his brother. Illidan could hardly bear to look at Malfurion, and did not even acknowledge his coming. Malfurion knew, of course, that this pain was growing in his brother's mind, but did not have the focus nor the will to address it at this time. Their bond and their kinship would be tested greatly in the coming future. Malfurion moved directly into Blackrook Hold and sought counsel with Curtalos Ravencrest. The commander did not meet Malfurion kindly, but he knew that he was the brother of Illidan, whom had recently saved his life, so he agreed to meet with him, calling Illidan to his side. Tensions were very high between the two brothers, but both of them knew that the survival of their people, and most importantly the safety of Tyrande, was at stake. Illidan was not aware of Ashara's treachery, but being the highly intelligent individual he was, he knew that the demons were not simply materializing from thin air. They had to be coming from somewhere. Although he could not even stand the sight of Malfurion, he knew his brother as one who always told the truth. And as much as it hurt him to say it, he knew his pursuit of the druidic arts had led him to an even more admirable of a person. Malfurion told the leaders of Blackrook Hold of his recent discovery that Queen Ishara and the Highborn were summoning the demons into Azeroth through the Well of Eternity, and were plotting to exterminate all of the lower caste. In his mind, Illidan knew Malfurion was speaking the truth entirely, but that is not what concerned him. Illidan was addicted to the acquisition of power. To him, he saw it as living up to his legacy and to impress Tyrande, but the truth was, he was becoming extremely powerful, but for all the wrong reasons. Illidan wanted to wield the power that Malfurion had recently discovered. He, too, wanted to walk the Emerald Dream and experience the omniscient capabilities granted by its sanctity. He, too, wanted to walk the Emerald Dream and experience the omniscient capabilities granted by its sanctity. But he had strayed from the path of Druidism and pursued the arts of the arcane, and Cenarius, no doubt, did not condone the instruction of Illidan any further. Lord Ravencrest, on the other hand, completely rejected Malfurion's claims. He himself was a highborn of the highest birthrights, and would never accept the fact that his bloodline had betrayed his people. Like the rest of his kin, Ravencrest literally worshipped Ashara, and to speak out against her was punishable by death. Illidan remained silent, but in his mind a war between justice and spite was transpiring. He could give his brother the trust and love that he deserved, or he could further pursue his rank and place in Ravencrest's army. When it would seem that Malfurion was to be thrown out of Black Rookhold for a heretic uprising, a soldier came dashing into the fortress, wounded and exhausted. The soldier happened to be one of Ravencrest's most trusted lieutenants. He had just come from Zinashari. When prompted what was amiss, the soldier reported that the city was in ruins, and demons had been pouring from Ashara's palace, slaughtering innocents. Ravencrest was in shock. He did not know how to respond, but after contemplating a resolution, he proclaimed that Ashara must be compromised or otherwise held prisoner by Xavius, his rival. The two of them were next in line of command after Ashara, and there was a constant power struggle between them. And so that was his decision. Ravencrest was to assemble the army and march upon the city of Zinashari to deal first-hand with Xavius' treachery. Given the events that had recently transpired in his favor, Malfurion quickly left Black Rookhold. Shortly afterward, he was approached by a tall, elf-like outsider that sought communion with him. The stranger was accompanied by a human. The Night Elves knew that the humans had descended from some of the oldest creations on Azeroth, but scarcely ever encountered them. They had recently been released from Cenarius' glade and knew of Malfurion from ancient history of their time. The human was the great Archmage Ronan, leader of the Kirin Tor. The cloaked stranger introduced himself as Krasis, and that he had come to aid them in their struggle against the demons. Krasis, being among the oldest dragonkin himself, knew full well that interfering unnecessarily with the past could have dire ramifications on the future, but he knew for certain that Malfurion was instrumental in the struggle of this time, so his survival was imperative. The two had agreed to intervene on behalf of Nosdormu, for the Bronze Aspect had sent them back in time through a rift to counteract the efforts of the old gods. But they must only balance the evil seeking to change the past, not overcome it, for that would change the future in an untold manner. It is important to note that Krasis had lived in this ancient time as well, so he quite literally existed as two individuals by being sent back in time. His past self was completely unaware of Nosdormu's actions, but felt the effects nonetheless. His power and his life force had been split among the two of them. It would logically throttle his significant potential as a combatant by half, but the effect was far more severe than one might expect. Krasis was sickly and weak, not having the life force to sustain enough energy to transform into his enormous dragon form, or be of much use as a dragon mage. So it would be decided that that would be left to his apprentice, Ronan. Malfurion was puzzled by the appearance of the two outsiders, but welcomed their aid regardless. They could not enlighten him as to why they were there or where they had come from, which naturally made it difficult for Furion to trust them, but he had more important matters to attend to. The army was assembling. Before Malfurion left to ponder his next course of action, Krasis told the druid that if the Burning Legion succeeded in summoning its Dark Master into Azeroth, no one and no force would be able to stop him from consuming the planet in darkness. A large wave of demons had discovered the Night Elven army gathering outside of Black Rookhold. They attacked them without warning and in great numbers. The frontline infantry aligned and held off the attacks, awaiting the Moon Guard to unleash their devastating magics from the rear. The Moon Guard assembled with Illidan at the front and began conjuring their offensive magic spells. Much to their dismay, though, their attacks were much less potent than they had expected, not even lethal, and some could not even muster the power to cast anything at all. Ravencrest shouted at them to begin casting, but they had no power at all at their disposal. The well had been closed to their access by Manoroth and Xavius. Illidan was in total shock and confusion. He and his men were useless without the power of the well. They watched as the soldiers in front of them were cleaved and crushed by the devastating Felguard. They all tried desperately to conjure the magic that had become a part of them, but only one succeeded in doing so: Ronan. He unleashed his attacks that seemed to come from hell itself, walls of flame and meteors from the sky. His magic was enough to toss the fell demons around like they were mere pebbles. The flames he conjured scorched the very flesh off of them like molten lava. Not only did he kill hundreds of them, but they were in complete awe of the human's abilities. Krasis was instructing him in these attacks, and occasionally unleashing spells of his own, although they were tolerable in comparison to Ronan's. The Moonguard observed the human mage with complete jealousy, as they were entirely perplexed as to how he was able to do this, Illidan most of all. Through the combined might of the Night Elves and the two outsiders, the demons fled as their burning carcasses were left behind to add a stench to the air that would seem to intoxicate the lungs of those native to Azeroth. Shortly after the battle, Ravencrest was no longer going to consider an explanation. He initiated a full-swing counterattack on the city of Zinashari. The army was out to move at nightfall. He confronted Illidan about the failure of the Moonguard in the last battle, and learned that the well had been isolated to the confines of Ashara's palace. Illidan approached Ronan and asked how he was able to conjure such magnificent spellwork without the use of the Well of Eternity. Ronan was a human from the future, and in his time, mages did not rely on the powers of the ancient wells, for they had been considered dangerous and addictive. Illidan treated Ronan with the greatest respect, for he was clearly of superior ability than himself, and sought only to learn from the human. And so Ronan began to instruct Illidan to draw from the universal forces that reside in all matter to fuel the potency of his spells, for the arcane existed everywhere at all times. Malfurion had watched as his people were slaughtered by the demon's attack, and could hardly cope with the knowledge that these atrocities were the result of their own leadership. He was a very empathetic individual, and knew that each of their losses were the result of something that should have never happened. He couldn't allow this to continue, and knowing that the Well of Eternity was now of no use to Illidan and the Moonguard, he decided he had to act right then. He sought solitude, for what he was about to do required the utmost concentration. Malfurion ventured deep into the forest and searched for trees with which he felt the greatest connection. He would need to channel their power and the power of nature into his own being to accomplish what he planned. When he found a suitable spot in one of the glades of Cenarius, Malfurion sat down and meditated. Within minutes, he was able to enter the Emerald Dream as he had before, only this time without the aid of his Shondo. His spirit ascended from his physical body, as he left it lying dormant and vulnerable. Once he was mobile throughout this ethereal dimension, he flew directly to the city of Zinashari. When he arrived there, he located the palace, and although he should have been invisible to anyone outside of the dream, he did not know his full capabilities in this form. Nor did he know the full capabilities of the demons surrounding the area, for that matter, so he strove to find a covert means of infiltrating the chamber which enclosed the Well of Eternity. He quickly learned that physical objects were mere imaginations in this world, and that in his spiritual manifestation, not only could he transport himself throughout the world in the blink of an eye, he could also bypass the physical components of nature. Malfurion flew through the outer walls of the palace and found himself directly in the chamber, looking upon Hakar, Xavius, and Manoroth. He was overwhelmed by the appearance of the demons, but his resolve was far too strong to be shaken by an emotion so tolerable as fear. Floating in his ethereal form in this chamber, Malfurion closely examined the spell matrix that kept the power of the well from anyone outside of Jinashari from accessing it. He was well versed in the arts of the arcane, and during his examinations found an opening through which he could destroy its foundations. However, one terrifying fact had slipped his mind. Lord Xavius was not only known among his people as Ashara's High Counselor. He had earned his position, unlike many of the Highborn. Xavius didn't have eyes. Instead, he had replaced them with arcane crystals, which he used to see through the use of magic. Malfurion had forgotten this fact, and was now confident that Xavius could in fact see him. He hid in the upper corner of the chamber ceilings, and watched Xavius closely to observe any signs of his knowing. Minutes passed, and Manaroth took leave with Hakar to begin bolstering the Legion for their coming invasion. In truth, Xavius had been aware of Malfurion's infiltration from the moment that he flew through the wall, and was simply waiting for a moment alone to prove to Sargeras that he was worthy of his blessing. He did not want the aid of the two demon lords in dealing with Malfurion, whom he had been observing through the magics of the well, as his abilities were growing at an unbelievable rate and would quickly oppose his own. In the blink of an eye, Xavius turned around and stared directly at Malfurion. Before he could react in time to defend himself, Xavius conjured an arcane blast that knocked Malfurion out of the air and onto the floor. It burned his dream form as if it were his own body. The pain was terrible, and just when it would seem he had failed and he would be destroyed at the hands of Lord Xavius, Malfurion heard a voice in his head. It was Krasis. He told Malfurion that he was joined by Tyrande and Broxigar, and that they were lending him their strength through his physical body. The mere thought of Tyrande filled Malfurion with a longing he could not describe. She was the chosen priestess of Elune, but more importantly, the love of his life. The thought that he would never see her again filled him with fear at the loss of his true love, and that inspired him to fight for his life. Not only that, but Krasis was instructing Malfurion on how to delve into their conjoined powers. Krasis was one of the eldest of the Red Dragonflight. Their very beings are life incarnate. They're the guardians of life itself. His added power filled Malfurion with seemingly limitless strength. He could feel the world around him. All of the elements seemed to bow before him. He was invigorated to the core with the power of the world, and after hearing the voice of his beloved, he knew that then it was not his time to fall. Not yet. He had much to do. All of this happened over the course of less than a second, for in the heightened state he was in, he was able to react to the proceedings of the physical realm in the passing of a moment unrecognizable by regular beings. He looked up to see Xavius channeling a spell that would no doubt be the end of him. Xavius drew from the well like no other night elf had before. He was also being directly strengthened by Sargeras himself. As he charged his spell, Xavius shouted, "You have but the power of the well upon which to draw, while I have the might of the god." Malfurion smiled at Xavius' lack of perception. He was unaware that Malfurion was a druid, for he was the first of his kind, and no one knew of his command over the power of the natural world, except for those closest to him. Malfurion called back to Xavius, "No, my lord, you have it turned around. For you, there's only the well, and the supposed might of a demon that claims godhood. For me, there's the power of the world itself as my ally." Before Xavius could cast his spell, Malfurion fell back into his druidic trance, where time passed almost at his command. He looked to the skies, and in a moment called forth all of the surrounding clouds. A downpour of unreal magnitude began, like Azeroth had never seen before. From the clouds, Malfurion called several bolts of lightning that carried 100 times the force of one in a typical storm. They struck the tower over the well's chamber, and the stones that held it together crashed down on the highborn holding the portal together. They were thrown aside, and many of them killed. Just as Xavius was about to unleash his terrible demonic spell upon the druid, Malfurion called down at least 5 bolts of this celestial lightning that struck Xavius over the course of just a few seconds. They burned him within and without. His skin was immediately charred and peeled off his bones. As his mutilated corpse stood before Malfurion, a torrent of rain pelted what was left of his body, which was swiftly followed by the thunder from his absolutely devastating attack, which resonated amplitude so marvelous that they shattered Xavius' bones until all that remained of him was the dust of a fallen night elf. After Xavius was destroyed, Malfurion turned his attention to the portal. He found himself looking into a hole in the fabric of reality. Immediately, he knew that he alone could not shut out this portal and keep the demons out of his world. And as he gazed into this hole, he heard a voice. It said to him, "You delay the inevitable. I will devour your world just as I have so many others." The druid responded simply, "You'll find us a sour treat," and with a wave of his hand, he commanded the elements to wash away the spell matrix that held the portal together and keep the outsiders from accessing the well's magic. He summoned a tornado on top of the portal, which sheared away the framework of the spell, while simultaneously calling down what remained of the fallen tower, so that its stones bombarded the portal. At last, he called for more bolts of lightning on top of the portal, and the entire chamber collapsed over the well of eternity, and almost seemed to be sucked into the portal like a vacuum. As Malfurion turned to flee, he heard the voice again. Sargeras shouted into his mind, "I will have you." His dream form was also being sucked into the portal, and through all of the efforts, for love and for his people, he could not escape the force that pulled him into the portal. Before Malfurion blacked out, he heard one last voice. It said, "I have you." Tyrande was holding Malfurion's head upon her knees, back in Cenarius' glade. Beside her was Krasis, Brox, and several high-ranking officers in the Elven army. They mourned the druid's body, as they had witnessed what had just happened. He had been sucked into the portal over the Well of Eternity, and was now in the captivity of Sargeras. She cried his name, and looked to the skies where she called out for the healing of Elune, though she received no response to her prayer. It would seem that all hope was lost for Malfurion, and that he had sacrificed his life for the betterment of his people. Or so it would seem. Elune did not respond, but the nearby trees began to move. They pulled together and seemed to fuse as one, but the elves could not see, for a brilliant emerald light emanated from them, and through the light stepped the forest lord himself. He walked slowly over to Tyrande and said, "Daughter of my dear Elune, your tears touch the heaven and the earth." And she replied, "I cry for him, my lord, one you also loved." He nodded to her and bent his forelegs to move closer to Malfurion's body. He touched his forehead gently and said, "He is like a son to me, and so I am pleased that he has one like you who also holds him so near." He chuckled, and a warm, calming gust of wind blew throughout the glade. Birds sung and flew about happily. A beam of sun shone down over the glade and onto the three. He said to her, "I heard your pleas to my dear Elune, both the spoken and the unspoken ones." The elves surrounding them all froze. Broxigar kneeled before Cenarius, bowing in homage to the demigod that had both saved his life and shown him how to defeat the demons. Most of the soldiers watched Cenarius with their mouths hanging open in pure astonishment. They had told stories of the son of Elune for generations, but few of them actually believed the legends. Cenarius opened his hand, and an emerald light rose from his open palm. The light hovered idly over Malfurion's head for a moment, as Cenarius stood once again, displaying his full height for all to see. The essence then descended into Malfurion's head, and his eyes opened abruptly. It was not Sargeras' voice that he had heard. It was Cenarius. The demigod had saved his dream form from the vacuum of the portal, and transported it back to his physical body. He awoke, and Tyrande embraced him, their love stronger than ever, for They had both been convinced that they would never see each other again. Cenarius departed them with words meant only for his apprentice. "You've made me proud, my Theroshan, my honored student." And as the demigod melded back into the trees, Malfurion said, "Thank you, Shondo." Back in Zinashari, Manoroth had been focusing his efforts too much on the forward attack and rallying his forces that he did not even sense the complete and utter destruction of the chamber containing his precious portal. He knew at that moment the Sargeras would be most displeased with him, and he was. Manoroth lashed out in anger, and in a deafening roar exclaimed his frustrations for all to hear. He yelled at the Houndmaster, Hakar, demanding that he find the one called Malfurion Stormrage and make him suffer. But to bring him back alive, for Sargeras wanted to personally end his life after an eternity of torment. Hakar left at once. Manoroth left his army immediately and returned to the Well of Eternity, where he found some of the highborn sorcerers still alive. In a moment's time he had them back on their feet by threatening to remove their heads from their bodies. Queen Ashara approached him and demanded to know what had happened, and when Sargeras would enter Azeroth, and he abruptly dismissed her, declaring her an empty mortal insect. She cast a spell on Manoroth that rendered him completely incapable of movement. She warned him that should he disrespect her again, that Sargeras would be made fully aware of his actions and would be punished greatly. For the two of them had made an agreement since even before the summoning had commenced. It was at that moment that Manoroth knew he and the entirety of the Burning Legion had underestimated Ashara, and with her, the entirety of the Keldori. He was speechless, and unsure if he was even capable of dealing with their mortal armies alone, given that their queen seemed to match, if not exceed, his own powers. Manoroth plunged his mind into what was left of the spell matrix over the portal, and through it he took hold of the Highborn's minds and funneled their power into his own. Manoroth was personally reconstructing the portal through which he would bring forth even more demons. Almost instantly, Manoroth was hailed by an entity he did not expect to hear, or that he thought could even commune with him given the strength of the spell. The voice told him that Sargeras was greatly disappointed in him, and that it would personally come through the portal to ensure that it be made strong enough for the entrance of the Dark Titan to come through. Manoroth knew the voice almost as well as he knew his own, for it was his master. Manoroth feared his wrath. He shouted at everyone surrounding the portal to get on their knees. All knelt but the Queen Ashara, and lastly, Manoroth bowed his head low to the ground, as the right hand of Sargeras and the supreme commander of the Burning Legion appeared out of a dark cloud of smoke that seeped through the Well of Eternity. Archimonde stood before them all.